Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my March 2026 reading wrap-up video. I only have 5 books to talk about in this video. A lot of the other reading I did in March was for the BookTube Prize, and I actually just recently posted my very long BookTube Prize ranking video for the octafinals. I got it down to 30 minutes, and I actually rambled a fair bit longer. But I think this video is going to be short and sweet as it is because I already have actually talked about 3 of these books in my recent AM reading videos. So this is just a brief recap, and then I do have 2 other books to talk about. So the first book I read was Fiona and Jane by Jean Chen Ho. This was my February page 112 tag pick, better late than never. And this was a really ruminative literary fiction novel. I remember being really drawn to the way that the author put a lot of thoughts into that one page, that the character Fiona was out drinking with a friend and then she gets a call that has her thinking about her financial problems at the time. Anyway, this book is, I would essentially say short stories that, go back and forth between Fiona and Jane's perspectives. Jane is first person, Fiona is third. They meet in Southern California. They're of an age with each other. They're both Taiwanese American, immigrants. Well, especially Fiona, who came directly from Taiwan, whereas Jane, her parents came from Taiwan. And so they're dealing with things growing up, like they have issues with their parents and with their backstories, and they're, growing up and, discovering their sexuality and parties, and Fiona ultimately follows a boy to college and to law school, and that kind of falls apart in New York. And then Jane is trying to be a screenwriter in Hollywood, and that's not working, so she's taking odd jobs and also like experimenting with her sexuality. And, these stories go, back and forward in time, and we see a bit about their relationships with other people there, and, the ways that racial and other things fall into them. But it's never a preachy book. It really is just ruminative literary fiction, and, their particular friendship is at the center of it, even when they spend most of their 20s apart. But it's about how they relate to each other. I think the big problem is that, the short story style, especially told out of chronological order, makes it really difficult to grasp onto a through line, so that actually I didn't even remember a lot as I sat down to try to talk about this book again, and I was doing some research and also remembering my thoughts as I was writing the book review, which I wrote a little late. But I do think ultimately this one isn't going to stick with me as much because of these issues. Next, I read Welcome Home, Caroline Klein by Courtney Preiss as my Buzzwordathon March pick for the covers. But anyway, this was easily my least favorite book of the month. I do think I just got to start being smarter in a way, because this sort of quirky contemporary fiction doesn't really work for me. It's not entirely a romance, although there is a romantic subplot. We have, a sort of plot-strong opening where Caroline was recently dumped in spectacular fashion. She's at loose end. She's in her late 20s. Doesn't have much going on for her. And then her father takes a horrible fall. He's mostly okay, and mostly needs her to come home and play for him on the neighborhood softball team. And so that's a major plot of her sort of finding a home again with these people, in so much as it's a home, because, her experience with the softball team is like tinged with sexual harassment, and she herself is rather violent. And I feel like a lot of that is unexplored, as is her alcoholism. Even when she gets a DUI and joins an AA program, and that's where she meets up with an old crush, it's still not explored in any real depth. And I just struggle with these sorts of books that just don't delve deeply into character stuff, because it's just much more interested in the quirk, I guess, and the vibes. And I'm not really falling for these vibes. Also, the Judaism was pretty scant, although, for what it was and what I could recognize, I enjoyed it. And finally, of the books I've mentioned before, I have Love Marriage by V.V. Ganeshananthan. This is a book that went up to the top of my Goodreads. I have a resolution to, skim the top of that list every year. And this is literary fiction, and once again, it's, not short stories at all, but a very vignette style that I feel like belies, a sort of story that I could fall for a little bit more, because I am a literary fiction lover, but I'm more in it for characterization than I am for, writing, experimental writing, all of that stuff, which this book has. Yalini is our main character, who is this daughter of Sri Lankan immigrants, and in the, most on-the-page story, in a way, of her story, is coming to terms with her Sri Lankan heritage, particularly when her uncle, who was a Tamil tiger, comes to Canada. It's sort of a grace visa, I suppose, because he's dying of cancer, and he's not allowed into the States because the tigers are deemed terrorists, and so he has to go to Canada because they're letting him in. And so Yalini and her mother, and father, go to see him and kind of reconcile with that tense part of their family history. Some of the tension is about the political reality of the Tamil tigers, but also the uncle wasn't thrilled with her parents' marriage and even went after the father at one point. And this sets, I guess, Yalini and the narrative into this big rumination on different types of marriages and what they mean. And so we go into large swaths of history about Yalini's family and the various marriages and so forth that they got into, and how they intersected with the politics of Sri Lanka during the 20th century. And it's just, it's too discombobulated for me. There's too many characters, too many names to follow. They're basically in and out of the story more or less in an instant. And I really wish that we could have talked about all of these big important issues of love and relationships and politics through Yalini's story, because she had some really interesting things going on, getting to know her uncle and getting to know her cousin, who was a lot more hardcore and sort of fundamentalist than she is. And that really gives her, for character stories, what you really need is something to change a character, for a character to go on an arc. And so all of this stuff could lead to her changing as a person and interacting with the world in new ways. But that was always sort of overshadowed by these vignettes that, just came and went so quickly that it just didn't form a cohesive enough story for me. So yeah, I feel like, this part of my reading was a bit of a bummer, kind of a meh reading month. And so then I went on to memoirs to end the reading month, and actually it really picked things up for me. And granted, I read these more recently, so they're more fresh in my mind, but I also do think that these stories are just more compelling to me. And so the first one I listened to on audio was Where We Keep the Light by Josh Shapiro. Josh Shapiro is currently Pennsylvania's governor, and he particularly came into the national and international limelight when he was vetted as a possible vice presidential pick for Kamala Harris when she entered the race. And then he particularly came back in the news again when last year he was hosting his family for his Passover Seder at the governor's mansion. Then they went to bed, and then the house was attacked, firebombed by an anti-Semitic terrorist. And so that's how he actually starts the book, and it actually got me to thinking about how this memoir was pretty recently published, but the Seder was last year's Seder. Now, we're now in the middle of Passover for 2026 or 5786, but this Seder was so recent, the Passover he's talking about, and that's how he starts the book, in basically giving sort of this, fraught reality check about realizing that, he's in the public eye, and that, he has to account for, himself and what he believes, because actually there, could be people who come after him, and his Jewish faith is such a big part of his life. And so, as a Jewish American, it was of interest to me to look into, the choices he makes and how he's made his religious and ethnic affiliations so central. And so then, the book does generally go into chronological, mostly biography of his life and the choices he made and how he went into service. And he's one of those, I feel like, really middle-of-the-road, moderate Democrats who is very driven by, his desire to be of service to others. And he attempts to be a little bit humble at times, but also kind of build himself up a little bit. Like, he's putting himself more on the public stage, and, this could also be a political message for his next career move, whatever that might be, because he's the type of person who definitely had the go-getter attitude from the beginning and, to his mind made some, pretty daring choices throughout his political career, jumping around different tracks. And so it was really, fascinating to learn about his history. I just, speaking of the BookTube Prize, I read Jesus Wept, which was about the 70 years of past history of the Catholic Church. And I talked about a lot of things in that book, and I only touched briefly on the sexual abuse cases, that have been rampant in the church. And Shapiro, as Attorney General in Pennsylvania, which was his last job, one of the major cases he took on was against Pennsylvanian clergy. And it was like, it wasn't just one, member of the clergy. It was sort of this grand action against all of them, and that it was actually this very long, drawn-out research and issue where, they were putting together the case and it was in complete secrecy. And he talked about the strain that it put on himself to read about these horrific acts, and how he couldn't rely on his wife, who, was often a bit of his rock, or is often a bit of his rock, but he had to keep that secret from her. So that was some harrowing stuff. And he talked about other, things as well that he was involved in, a lot about what he took on as AG. He came into that position when Trump became president the first time, and so actually his office sued Trump several times when Shapiro thought that his policies were in violation of the law. And then he also went after, big business sometimes. And so that was sort of, he has this penchant really to stand up for the little man. And he talks about like how, interacting with people, it's, all sorts of people, both sides of the aisle people, really ramps him up. And there's, he narrated the audiobook, and, I feel like there was a genuineness to it, And as someone who's like a fellow moderate Democrat, I feel like he struggles in ways I kind of struggle, to try to find the nuance in the middle line between lots of different realities, like when it comes to police violence and the need for reform, but also the need for, security on the streets and in neighborhoods, and like where to find that balance and where to speak to the empathy of the most people. And then this comes up again as he's talking about how he's being vetted for vice president, and this is in the wake of October 7th, and he comes out against some of the campus protests in Pennsylvania because he saw that some of it went beyond, First Amendment free speech rights and went into being violent and intimidating, especially to Jewish students. So he felt the need to stand up for them. And he says, I'd stand up for any students who feel, intimidated on campus. And so that was really interesting to talk about his relationship with Harris's vetting team. And, I have the bias of coming in as a Jew myself, an American Jew, wanting to know how an American Jew in a position of power represents the people, but also represents our community, our religious ethnic community. And so, in a way, it's interesting. He didn't talk about it as much in the book, but he mentioned how he was taken aback when Harris's team demanded to know whether he had ever been a secret agent for Israel, which just really belies a misunderstanding about how American Jews relate to Israel, and how it's not about some sort of dual loyalty thing. It's just an inherent connection to, where the other half of our ethnic community live, because by and large, not entirely, we're kind of half and half between America and Israel. And actually, this was talked about in a lot more depth in an interesting JTA article I'll link down below. But yeah, so yeah, there's just a lot in here that I think, really spoke to me. I thought, he also spoke about his family life a little bit and trying to juggle things, and his earnest, desire to, show up for his kids and his wife. Slightly future Rachel here. I thought I'd try again to talk about my last and favorite book of the month, because it was just such an impactful book to me that I wanted to, give it a second go to better collect my thoughts and not be quite so off the cuff, but we'll see. So anyway, my final and favorite book I'm talking about in March is Hostage by Eli Sharabi. So this is the first memoir published first comprehensive memoir published by an Israeli hostage of October 7th, and then it was translated into English last year. Eli Sharabi is a 50-something-year-old man. He was taken from his home in Kibbutz Be'eri on the southern coast of Israel near Gaza. He lived with his wife and daughters, and he was taken alone into Gaza. It's a short book, but it chronicles a lot of the major events that happened to him. He was thrown into a stolen car with a Thai worker, and then they were taken first to a mosque where they had to walk in the streets of Gaza, and there was worry. There was so much jubilation in the streets, and they were worried about being lynched, and Hamas in a macabre way kind of became their protectors to keep that from happening. So he spent the first couple months or month or so of captivity in a house of a Hamas operative, although there's various, levels of Hamas operatives, and he, gets to know a few of them as they cycle into the next year or so of his life. He and Kung are trapped in this house. Kung is, that's what he knows to call this man who speaks no Hebrew, no Arabic, no English, is obviously very overwhelmed about being in this situation. Sharabi himself tries to go into survival mode. In bits and pieces, he learns about how huge October 7th was. At one point, he's passing the television in the family's living quarters and realizes that women and children were kidnapped, and that, sets him crying one of the first times. Ultimately, Gaza is undergoing aerial bombing by the IDF. So after a month or so, most of the hostages, I believe, are taken, Sharabi especially, is taken into the tunnels, which is sort of a claustrophobic, harrowing experience for him at first. And he's separated from Kung. And the truth is, I don't know who Kung is. He doesn't know. The name doesn't match any of the Thai hostages that I recall seeing. No one's come forward to say that Sharabi met him in the book. But for the rest of his time, Sharabi is with Israeli men. He's brought into the tunnels, and there's a lot of sort of movement among, I guess, Hamas terrorist cells about moving who where. He spends a little bit of time with three of the beautiful six, as they're now called. These 6 hostages were killed by Hamas in August of 2024. The most famous of which is Hirsch Goldberg Poland, because his mother has become really infamous in, advocating for the release of all the hostages. And Hirsch himself in this book, he comes in, he's lost an arm in an explosion at the Nova Music Festival. And he's this quiet and introspective man who gives Sharabi a piece of advice that he carries with him through the rest of his captivity, which is, if you have a why, you can endure any how. So Sharabi takes this into his mission, his sort of bolstering up of himself as somebody who's going to survive this. And he's mostly with younger men. Ultimately, Hirsch and the other 2 of the beautiful 6 are taken away. The Hamas says that they're being taken away to be returned to Israel, and so Sharabi doesn't know until later that they had been killed. But Sharabi is left with 4 other men who ultimately are also released, most of them near when he is. And he talks about being the father figure to them, and in trying to, bolster the spirits of these, 20 and 30-something men, about the tensions of what it's like to be confined together, especially as they are moving between different sort of cells in the tunnels. They're kind of like, I guess, little apartment units of a sort, where the terrorists who are overlooking them are in one room and they're in the other, and they have to spend all of their time basically asking these terrorists for anything, including how to use the bathroom. And there's a lot of psychological manipulation going on in all of this. And this is before the starvation kicks in, because in the very beginning they are fed decently well, but then as the war goes on, the Hamas starts withholding food for them. In general, there's less food in too, but you know, the hostages in particular are left to one meal a day. They're growing emaciated and sickly, and you know, it's always a struggle to see if whether or not the terrorists will get them any help. Like, what is their use as these bargaining chips? Sharabi talks about getting to know the terrorists. You know, a lot of times these men are, you know, being psychologically and physically abusive to them, but you know, they also do spend months and years together. So you know, the hostages give these men nicknames like Nightingale and Triangle and Circle, and Sharabi talks about their different personal attributes and the sort of relationships he forms with them, and how this is sort of a human response to being in this close proximity, even though they know on this deeper level that you know, they're enemies. I mean, the Hamas terrorists like explicitly see the Israelis and Jews more as well. You know, they use a lot of anti-Semitic tropes as, you know, their enemies, and they believe wholeheartedly in a full fundamentalism that denies the Israelis any right to exist. And so meanwhile, Sharabi's in survival mode and, you know, understands what's going on in the broader world in bits and pieces, but spends most of these weeks and months trying to conserve energy and exercise as well as he can, and conserve food, because he so often is without significant food, and he can, like, you know, tell how his stomach's caving in and his hearing is starting to go, and he's trying to be the emotional support for these younger men, especially when they are losing, you know, that strength and that will to go on. And so they all talk a bit about learning about each other and about their families, and of course they have no real idea what's really happening with their families. And you know, Sharabi gives a bit of his backstory about his you know, his life in Beersheva as a manager, and his love story with his wife, and a little bit about the personalities of his daughters and everything he's pining for, about what makes him a person and what he wants to go back to survive for, and also for himself beyond his family as well. So ultimately, after Trump is reelected the second time, is when a second hostage deal starts to take place, and that's when Sharabi is released. There's still a bit of tension. At one point, one of the Hamas operatives brings in a laptop of people kidnapped around Be'eri. He recognizes some neighbors, he recognizes his brother, and Hamas does tell him that his brother was killed. They mean for him to use it in propaganda and videos, and in the, you know, macabre handover session for the hostages that they had, that he has to say that, you know, that his brother was killed by the IDF. So he's dealing with that reality. And then he finds out, you know, there's more and more tension, you know, because it's never quite sure when exactly he will be handed off to the IDF. It happens in bits and spurts. He's in the car with the Red Cross, and one of his neighbors who he's released with demands, like, where were you guys? Why couldn't you check up on us? You know, this is a humanitarian issue. We didn't see you ever until now. And the lady from the Red Cross is saying they wouldn't let us see you. Ultimately, Sharabi does get to the IDF, and the operative tells him that his mother and his sister are waiting for him, and that's when he starts to realize his wife and daughters were killed on October 7th. And so we go into the emotional reality of that for him, and it ends with him, you know, finalizing things by saying goodbye to them at their graves, and, you know, that says, I guess, his closing of this particular awful chapter in his life, which was so harrowing but important for me to bear witness to. You know, for years I, you know, lived on the streets here, and I thought about the hostages, I thought about where they were, what was happening to them. Sharabi's story was both unsurprising but still just so gut-wrenching as well, and what he had to go through to survive, and what the people around him had to go through to survive, and the cost of all of this hatred and violence. So much to bear. Also the fleshing out of the people around him, these names that in our community we grew to know so well as we talked about and remembered and advocated for these people, to learn a little more about Hirsch, and to learn more about Alon Ohel, who stayed with, was the person in captivity who Sharabi knew the best, and he ultimately was released. Beautiful piano player who, anyway, it's, I am really glad I ended the month with this book to bear witness to this powerful testimony, this searing part of Jewish history that's so recent that we're still trying to, you know, overcome and understand how to live with. And this book is a major part of that. And that about covers it for me now. Maybe I did talk longer than I hoped to because I see my battery went down a little significantly. Oh well, but speaking of AM reading videos, expect me back on this channel in the next couple of days for my first AM reading video of April, moving forward into new books and hopefully new good experiences. I hope all of you are continuing to enjoy your reading as we enter into a new season. Certainly where I am in the DC area, it's definitely starting to be a bit springy. It's getting a little warmer, significantly warmer. I think the cherry blossoms have come and gone, alas! But there will be other flower trees blooming soon, so that'll be nice. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.